I'm Marcy Darnowski, and this is Talking Biopolitics. This is a session part of our 2017-2018 season. And our Talking Biopolitics series is conversations about the social meanings of human biotechnologies. We bring cutting-edge thinkers and writers and filmmakers to talk with you about those issues. Today, we're very honored and fortunate to have with us the speakers who you see on the slide that's pictured in the image area. Shobita Parthasarathy on the left is the author of the book that's at the center of today's conversation. And the book is Patent Politics, Life Forms, Markets, and the Public Interest in the United States and Europe. Its cover is shown in the middle of the screen, and it's a close-up of a cow looking at the camera with a tag on its ear that reads Patent 0815. And on the right of that image, you'll see a photo of Tania Simoncelli, who will be talking with Shobita about her book. Also on this slide is information about getting technical assistance connecting to our webinar platform. If you're having any problems, if you need help with Adobe Connect, for example, please contact Kayla Tolentino, and you can call Kayla at 510-665-7760, extension 302, or email her at KTOLENTINO@geneticsанdsociety.org. Her phone number again, 510-665-7760, extension 302. Now I'm going to be turning things over to Shobita and Tania in just a few minutes after a couple more logistical notes, and I will give them both formal introductions too. Then the two of them will talk for about 30-35 minutes. I'll be then back for a very short interlude before we bring in your questions and comments. And we would invite you to send those questions and comments at any point during the webinar, and then we'll turn to them after that interlude that I mentioned. So you can do that by putting your questions in the Q&A box that you see at the right of your screen, and those questions will be seen only by the folks at CGS who are helping out behind the scenes, for which we thank them. And if you have any questions about technical issues or things that you would like everyone on the webinar to see, you can type those into the chat box that you see at the bottom right there. I want to remind you that this event is being recorded and that it will be available in the near future with a transcript on CGS's website and on our YouTube channel as well. Okay, let me take a moment to describe the other features of the webinar platform. Below the image area, you'll see a closed captioning box, and I want to take this opportunity to thank our captioners, and also to note that I will be describing, as I have already, the images that we display so that anyone who's on the phone or has a vision impairment can follow along. I mentioned the Q&A boxes and the chat box. Again, please submit your comments at any time. And again, the Q&A questions go to Tania, Shobita, and the behind-the-scenes CGS staff. And the chat box, anything in the chat box is seen by everyone, all participants. All right, let's go to the next slide. We wanted to tell you that we have a wealth of other video recordings and some transcripts of previous Talking Biopolitics conversations. Our most recent one took place in August, and what you see on the screen here is an image on the left of Ben Hurlbut, the author of Experiments in Democracy, Human Embryo Research and the Politics of Bioethics. The book's cover is in the middle and shows microscope photographs of a dividing embryo both in its upper right corner and lower left corners. And on the right side of the slide, you see a photo of Patricia Williams, the Columbia University legal scholar and Nation columnist who interviewed Ben about his book. These recordings and transcripts are great resources for classes and great ways to hear directly from some of the key people who are thinking about a new biopolitics. And we will be sending you links to all these things in a follow-up email. Our next Talking Biopolitics conversation will be in January after the holidays, and this one will feature Jenny Reardon, professor of sociology and the founding director of the Science and Justice Research Center at UC Santa Cruz. She's pictured on the left here, and on the right you'll see a photo of Alondra Nelson, who is the president of the Social Science Research Council, and she's a professor of sociology at Columbia University. Jenny and Alondra will be talking both about Alondra's recent book, The Social Life of DNA, Race, Reparations, and Reconciliation After the Genome, and also about Jenny's book, which will be published in December. Her book is titled The Post-Genomic Condition, Ethics, Justice, and Knowledge After the Genome, and that will be available through UC Press. And we'll be in touch soon to let you know the exact date and time of that upcoming conversation. This next slide shows a little bit of information about the Center for Genetics and Society. So what it says is that the Center for Genetics and Society is a nonprofit social justice organization that works to ensure an equitable future where human genetic and reproductive technologies benefit the common good. CGS works toward a new biopolitics grounded in the values of social justice, human rights, ecological integrity, the common good, and democratic governance. And next slide, please. We wanted to tell you just a little bit about some of the recent work we've been doing at CGS. A major focus in recent years, really, has been on the controversy about human germline modification, or germline editing, as it's now often called. Along with many, many others around the world, we believe that allowing those who could afford it to control the genes and traits of their future children would all too likely open the door to new forms of inequality and discrimination. And in the current political situation, we see that threat as especially dire, given the staggering levels of economic inequality that we already live with, and as well as the resurgence of toxic ideas about race as a genetic category rather than a social category. Now, the links on this slide are live, and we will also be sending them to you in a follow-up email, so you'll be able to watch those webinars, the one on the left about disability justice and gene editing, and the one on the right, which is a reference to a webinar we did about gene editing in the future of reproductive justice. The disability justice webinar shows the speakers for that webinar. They were Mia Mingus, Tom Shakespeare, Anna Cameron, and Rosemary Garland Thompson. And our partner organizations for that webinar were the Disability Rights, Education, and Defense Fund, the Disability Visibility Project, and the Paul K. Longmore Institute on Disability. On the webinar that you see on the right there, the one about gene editing and reproductive justice, our speakers were Dorothy Roberts, Ruha Benjamin, and Lisa Ikamoto, and our co-sponsors were Black Women for Wellness and In Our Own Voice, National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda. We are now planning a couple other theme-specific webinars on human gene editing. And as with the Talking Biopolitics webinars, we do make those available online, and we will let you know about them as they're planned. This slide also shows a donate button and a subscribe to our newsletter button at the bottom, and we invite you warmly to do both. Okay, so that's the housekeeping, and now let me turn to introductions of Shobita and Tania. So if I can ask you, Shobita and Tania, to start sharing your webcam. While that's happening, maybe I will just go ahead and start the introductions to tell you a little bit about our two wonderful speakers today. Shobita Parthasarathy is Assistant Professor of Public Policy and Women's Studies, and also Director of the Science, Technology, and Public Policy Program at the University of Michigan. Here we are, great. Shobita studies policy and politics related to science and technology, with a particular focus on the politics of evidence and expertise in policymaking in the US, Europe, and India. She currently sits on the Governing Council of the Science and Democracy Network, and until recently, she sat on the Council of the Society for the Social Studies of Science. Shobita's first book was titled Building Genetic Medicine, Breast Cancer Technology and the Comparative Politics of Healthcare. That was published in 2007 by MIT Press, and it compared the development of genetic testing for breast cancer in the US and Britain. That book and the findings from it helped to inform the US Supreme Court case over gene patents that was decided in 2013, and that I think we're going to be hearing about today because it figures so largely in the politics of patents. Tania Simoncelli is also here with us, and Tania has worked on a wide range of science policy issues, including gene patenting, personalized medicine, and forensic DNA databases. And she's done that in a number of positions. I'm very pleased to say that in the early days of the Center for Genetics and Society, Tania was a program director with us. And in the 15 years since then, she's worked as science advisor for the ACLU, as senior advisor at the FDA, as assistant director for forensic science and biomedical innovation at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. That was under the Obama administration when that office existed. And also as senior advisor to the director at the Broad Institute. While Tania was at the ACLU, she spearheaded the development of that successful landmark challenge to the patenting of human genes, the one that I just mentioned that was decided at the Supreme Court. And Tania recently joined the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative as its director of policy for science. So Shobita and Tania, I'm so glad that you're here for this conversation today. Thank you very much. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So we're going to have you talk with each other for about 35 minutes, and then we'll pause briefly to bring in the questions and comments from those who are listening and watching. And I'll turn it over to you now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Marcy. It's so great to be back here at the Center for Genetics and Society. And it's especially great to be here with you, Shobita, to talk about this really wonderful book that you've produced that I think is it's just so important for advancing our understanding of the patent system, and more broadly why this system is so important to understand for those of us who are concerned about issues around democratization of technology, around social justice, around the public interest issues and accountability of government, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we could probably talk all day about this book, for sure, especially given our own histories and our having known each other for some years. But I'll try to help us pull out and tease out some of the highlights and things that I found especially interesting about your book to at least give people a flavor. And I hope everybody on the listening will go out and read it if they haven't already. So to start, why don't we talk a little bit about, why patents? How did you decide to focus on this topic and delve into this, this book that I'm sure took an extraordinary amount of work and time.
Thanks. Thanks to CGS for this opportunity, and thank you for reading the book and taking the time to chat about it. Yeah, so I guess, I started out, I think the first time that I heard about patents, biotechnology patents in particular, was in graduate school, my first year of graduate school. And one of my professors was talking about patents on human genes, actually. And I had a science background. I had a biology undergraduate degree. And I just thought to myself, that's really strange. And, he tried to explain why, and I still didn't completely, it didn't completely make sense to me. And I'll get back to that in a second. But, and then I started working on a PhD dissertation that became my first book, and that was, at least on its face, I thought, I certainly didn't think it was about patents. But then as I was doing the research, I realized that intellectual property was a central part of the story, that it framed research around breast cancer genetics, healthcare around breast cancer genetics. There were moral questions that arose for me about, what does it mean to own life in this way? And I think it was sort of a dual interest, I think, that emerged as I was doing that work, which was, first of all, because the first book was also comparative, although, really strictly between the U.S. and Britain, I became initially aware that there were differences. I didn't know the extent of those differences at the time, but the second thing, and the real thing that I think connects to our interest in what you were talking about, is that I thought to myself, this is, a logic that makes sense to a number of people, but doesn't make sense to outsiders, right? So how does that logic come to be? And how is it that it is an area that gets walled off as technical when in fact it's incredibly consequential for our lives? And, over time, I think one of the things that the book argues is that the production of the patent system as technical and esoteric is in fact a political outcome, right? That's incredible work that's being done by people, institutions, processes, and practices inside the patent system, despite the enormous, I think, implications for public
that's
interest.
Great. Yeah, that's a great segue into sort of my next question, which is really about the sort of the overarching theme in your book. So you start the book with this wonderful discussion about some of the core, both the similarities and the differences, right, between the patent systems in the United States and Europe. So on the one hand, the systems that emerged sort of on the surface, they seem kind of similar, right? Even the institutions that make decisions about patents, sort of on the surface, though they seem like similar institutions, and yet there's some really important sort of foundational or fundamental differences. And then you go on, and it's just so great, because then you go on in the book and you sort of go through almost in a case study sort of way some of these core controversies that are arisen around these life patent or life form patents, and how those differences that you describe in the beginning really play out and really shape public debates and the controversies themselves and actually the outcomes, and why they're both similarities and differences that come out at the end of the pipeline of all of that. And so let's just talk a little bit to sort of, I'd love to get into some of those specific sort of case studies or some of those interesting controversies. But to begin, talk a little bit about some of those fundamental differences, and what are they and where do they come from, and what produced them.
Yeah. So what I argue in the book is that the U.S. and Europe think really differently about the relative roles of government, the marketplace, and morality when it comes to innovation, right? Yeah. So these are really fundamental differences. And I say in the U.S., we think about the role of government when it comes to innovation as being market making. That is, especially, for example, in the context of the patent system, the role is to create these structures, and then the consumer kind of makes decisions about what's moral, and, the questions about distributional justice kind of happen, they trickle down into other institutions, but it's not the government's job to be involved in those kinds of distributional questions. Whereas in the European context, I argue, the approach is more of a market-shaping approach. So the idea is that there is a role for government in enforcing a broader moral order. That comes when it comes to distributional issues. It comes when it comes to questions about commodification of life forms through patents. So those are sort of the big picture differences, I argue, that you see broadly in innovation policy, that when you look at the patent system, what that means is a few things. So the first, if you talk about the U.S. context, it means that we tend to think about the inventor's interest and the public interest as being the same thing, right? So if it's good for the inventor, it's good for the public, and in fact, we are all, to the extent that we understand the public as distinct from the inventor, they're only inventors in waiting, right? They're about to become inventors, and so everyone has an interest in a strong patent system and more invention. And so then alongside that, you have a system that focuses on technical and legal questions, and interprets relevant evidence and expertise in that way. It also is very much focused on, how objective does the patent system work, right? To what extent are patent examiners operating solely and narrowly according to, scientific publications and patents and legal precedent. In the European context, you have, this market shaping ideology then means that there's a role for government in balancing an inventor's interest with the public interest, which is seen as distinct, right? Yeah. So it's not to say that as you said, right, there are many similarities. It's not like the European patent system doesn't see the inventor's interest as also the public interest. It's just that they It's just that they also see that there are places, specifically in when it comes to life forms, around distributional questions and around ethical questions as being potentially different, which then means that they think about patents as potentially moral and socioeconomic, which, if you think about it that way, then you have to leverage different kinds of evidence and expertise and different kinds of participants, right? So there are all of these kind of trickle-down effects when it comes to how you think about governance of in the patent system, but also more broadly from innovation, from those kind of initial, I think, broad differences between the two places.
And, in Europe, these are deeply cultural differences. These are not just, and so you can see, one of the things that I found fascinating that I had forgotten about was that in France, they actually banned pharmaceutical patents, at least initially, right? And back in the 1800s. So that's a sort of a striking, it's really phenomenal. And you talk a little bit about how that came about and how that was sort of an important early indicator that we had a very different sort of approach.
Even more than that, I would say, a number of European countries banned different kinds of things from patentability. But one of the really interesting comparative points to me is that, at some point in the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, European countries are thinking, okay, maybe we shouldn't have such strict laws. So they say, let's envision compulsory licensing, right, as a solution. That is, the government can step in if a patent holder is holding too fast to their invention and force that patent holder to license it broadly, which addresses these socioeconomic distributional concerns, right? At the same time, the U.S. Congress is also having the same kinds of conversations, and yet U.S. Congress people are responding to sort of military officials and public health officials who are worried that because of intellectual property, that people on the battlefield might be in some way disadvantaged by saying, no, you don't understand. Essentially, they say, but inventors are morally responsible. They would never actually, do anything. Right. They have an interest in making their technologies publicly available. And what that's meant is that, while in Europe there's compulsory licensing legislation explicitly on the books, in the U.S. we don't have that analog. Right. So even from long before biotechnology was a glimmer in anyone's eye, you saw these differences emerging.
Yeah, it's really great. So let's talk a little bit about how this plays out, especially in the U.S. context. So 1980 landmark Supreme Court decision, Diamond versus Chakrabarti. They uphold Chakrabarti's patent on a bacterium that's genetically modified to ingest oil. So talk a little bit about this case. Why this was so important. One of the astonishing things to me when I was reading your account of the case is that there were only 15 amicus briefs filed, and there was only one on the saying that the patent should not be considered patent eligible. So that's sort of striking to me. Sort of why wasn't there more sort of public engagement in this case? Well, first of all, talk about why this case was important and what was at stake, what was it about, and why wasn't there more public engagement in the United States in this?
Well, I think, maybe we'll get to this later, but I think that there's, in part it's a testament to you to think about how the world has shifted to some degree now. Even I know in the early days when we were sort of thinking about the gene patent case, it wasn't that easy to get people involved, right? So in fact, I think there's a catalyst that you were instrumental in. But But if we go back to the Chakrabarti case, I think there are a number of things that are super interesting about it, right? So first, it kind of very quickly gets made into a technical question, right? So one of the nice things for me about doing comparative work is that you have a counterfactual, you have another potential narrative, right? And in the European context, the same kinds of questions get asked in legislative spaces. Whereas in the US, those questions get shunted into the courts. And even though there are moments where there's people trying to say, maybe this should be the kind of conversation that should be happening among elected representatives, there's not much interest among those elected representatives to take this issue on. Mm-hmm. So it gets very much framed in a technical and legal way. And as you said, right, you have 14 amicus briefs from universities, from biotech companies, from individual scientists, from patent law associations, advocating in favor of this. This is a moment, I think one of the answers to your question is that this is a moment where people don't know much, but they also are worrying, thinking about the U.S. in a globally competitive environment. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of rhetoric around how, elsewhere they're rushing into this, which of course isn't really true.
This is, of course, the very beginning of the biotech industry, right?
So, and yet it has enormous rhetorical power. Mm-hmm. And the other thing I'll say is that I went back and I looked at all of the Supreme Court and appellate court cases around patents, from the 19th century to the present, and this was the first time that you saw civil society groups get involved. And part of it is about the history of civil society, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's only in the 1970s that we have the environmental movement, the women's health movement, the women's movement, the civil rights movement. So that's part of it too, right? Mm-hmm. This is all sort of coalescing at this moment. And so they come in and they issue this brief that and this is Jeremy Rifkin and other groups that he's working with, mm-hmm. and it looks completely different than any other patent document, that you've really seen before, because he's talking about bioethics and philosophy and in the environmental implications, commodification of life forms. How is this going to transform the relationship between humans and the ecosystem? And what's fascinating to me, and this is something that I think I learn over time and I discuss over time as characteristic of the U.S. system in particular, is the response to Rifkin, and the response essentially to anything except for technical and legal argumentation is, you don't understand. No, you don't get it. You don't, right? You're ignorant. Right. You don't understand. This is not the role of the patent system. It's designed to do very narrow things. It doesn't have anything to do with questions of morality, right? Of course, that's very loaded, highly political. It's a way of distinguishing those spaces where people can engage and ask public interest and social justice questions in mm-hmm. the spaces that they can't, right? Mm-hmm. And so over time, they continue to police these boundaries. And in some ways, I mean, to link it to your work in the Myriad case, it is, in some ways, it distorts the substance of the Myriad case, but I think that the discussion around the Myriad case has transformed the public conversation about intellectual property. Mm-hmm. The question is now you see, I think before maybe there was a lot of trust that, okay, the patent system, it basically works in the public interest. It's super technical. Mm-hmm. We don't totally understand, but it's working on our behalf. Yeah. But now I think there are counter narratives out there. And the question really is, how long can the patent system resist the pressure that there are these other concerns, there are these other people that are saying, no, the way that you've constructed the public interest, the way that you've constructed democracy is not appropriate, and it's not, in fact, benefiting us, right? And I think that that's where you've seen a real sea change.
Yeah, no, that's great. So let's talk a little bit about Myriad, although I do kind of want to go back to the animal patent debate and some other things if we have time. I know that time runs quickly in this program. So I have to admit it was especially fun for me to read your book because the very tensions that you point out about, these assumptions that the patent system actually does deliver, is serving the public's interest. And there's sort of this presumption out there that, in the United States, that there's really no space for this other debate or sort of public interest groups to really come in, because by definition, the system is actually serving that interest. That played out so much in this case, and the technical legal sort of framing of patents played out so much in the Myriad case, and even internally at the ACLU. So as you alluded to, when I sort of brought this issue to the ACLU, and in fact, my interest in patents were very similar to yours. I read Diamond versus Chakrabarti when I was an undergraduate, in Sheila Jasnoff's class. Someone else who we share who was a mentor to both of us. And, I was just so struck by, like, wow, this is revolutionary technology, and who's really thinking about it, and how is the public's interest being sort of thought about in this new space. But when I brought this issue to the ACLU, there was sort of this, Chris Hansen, who actually argued the case, was immediately struck by, sort of going back to what you said at the very beginning of our conversation, this basic logic that this didn't make sense. That was his reaction. But there were others at the ACLU who were much more skeptical, and they sort of said, well, I don't understand. Aren't patents, like, good for science? And if we actually prevailed in this case, like, would that be good for science or bad for science? Like, this complete sort of, this whole framing that you talk about in your book had completely shaped their perceptions. And even at the ACLU, an organization that is poised to question, question authority, question legal boundaries, question institutions. So even there was sort of this, wait, I don't get it. I thought patents were good for the public interest. And so we had to really work within the ACLU to explain sort of what was going on, and really explain and sort of delve into some of this deeper discussion. Mm-hmm. And I even talked about differences between the United States and Europe, and why, these things haven't been challenged in the United States to date, in part because there wasn't really a proper space for public debate. And so that was just really, really fun to talk about, and something I think that we were up against in the case, and also this idea of patents being highly specialized matters. We knew throughout the case that there was going to be, that Myriad was going to argue, you guys don't know what you're talking about, this is this narrow technical issue, and we did everything we could to keep broadening the discussion and to bring in a broad coalition of voices to show how these patents were actually harmful in various ways, and we're actually not just undermining innovation and doing the very opposite that the patent system is supposed to serve, but also impacting patients, impacting the provision, clinical diagnostic testing, et cetera, et cetera. So all that being said, and yet we still had to argue, when we went to court, we still had to argue within the sort of confines of Diamond versus Chakrabarti. Yeah, and in fact, that case, we felt that the law was on our side clearly, even if you were okay with the Supreme Court's decision, because it said products of nature are not patent eligible. But I don't know, do you think that that didn't go far enough? And I guess the question is, we did create this broad coalition. We did overturn gene patents. You cannot patent genes in the United States, but what else is needed? Like, what would real change look like? Is it Diamond versus Chakrabarti that really needs to be undone? Do we have to take an even deeper look, or something else that needs to be done?
So I think, let me go back and then I'll answer your question. So, I think it's, telling and incredibly fascinating, right? How, these kinds of logics, these political cultures and ideologies seep so much into the ether that it's everywhere, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's an incredibly interesting thing. And for me anyway, as a social scientist, shows how implicitly these things matter. But I also argue in the book that the Myriad case would not have existed without the ACLU, right? Mm-hmm. Because you needed an outsider, because it was a logic that had been ingested and had, everyone had moved around it. Everybody had sort of accepted that this was the way that things worked, and so everybody was sort of working within a particular paradigm. And you needed an organization that was outside of at least the interests around that paradigm, even if they were still kind of ingesting the Kool-Aid as it were, but also had a certain level of expertise in litigation and in the maneuvering, political maneuvering, right? I mean, and legal maneuvering. That was a unique combination. It's not entirely clear to me, and the weight, obviously, of the ACLU. I mean, it's not clear to me that it would have been possible. And in fact, right, I mean, the sort of discussions around this case started 10 years after the patents were issued, in part because healthcare professionals and patients that I had spoken to for my first book had essentially said, like, this is the way it works. Yes. Even if we think that this company doesn't work well, this is the way that works. Or they would say, this company might be bad, but in general, we know patents are good, right? So you needed an outsider. So that's the first thing that I'll say. But in terms of, I think Myriad was great. I think it obviously had an enormous impact on genetic testing, availability, and the kind of downstream technologies that require, mapping and sequencing human genes. I argue a couple of things. One is I actually think that the cultural shift could in some ways be even more important, right? That people are asking questions, that people are seeing potential avenues for challenging patents, that those exist. I think that's important. It's interesting. I'm hoping that there's more of those things to come. But from a broader perspective, one of the big problems and one of the challenges that you guys had is that it isn't just cultural and rhetorical, although those are very, very important and those are real things, and the way I think about the way politics works. It's that there are real structural barriers that embody those cultural differences that make it difficult for any public interest or social justice group to get involved, right? There are strict legal standing requirements. There are requirements around, as you said, the kinds of arguments that you can make within the patent office. I mean, just to return briefly to the comparison, one of the things you see in the European context is that the European Patent Office itself is trying to struggle with ethical questions and incorporating bureaucratic processes and, sort of bringing in ethics expertise in a variety of ways. And so, I think we need to think about, ways to make it easier for alternative understandings of the public interest and explicitly social justice concerns can be integrated. And there are, I think, a specific set of things that could be done that people can advocate for in order to achieve that.
For example, creating more sort of explicit places where these public debates can occur, creating opportunities, the PTO could do more to be a more open institution, right? So I think we have to take a little break right now, and then we can come back and see what questions are coming in from our viewers, and then also continue our discussion. So
okay, I'm sorry. I somehow got disconnected audio-wise, so let me say what I said again. And it was really just to thank both of our speakers for the conversations that they just had and that we'll be able to continue in a few minutes. And also to thank them for the work that they've done over many years, both of them, to bring the values of democracy and social justice and the public interest into the way we understand how scientific knowledge is produced and how scientific and technical innovations are deployed. I think that's such an important area for all of us to understand and to work in. So we're going to take this very brief break here, and that will let Tania and Shobita take a quick look at some of the questions and comments that you've been sending, and we invite you to keep them coming. And while they do that, we wanted to show you links to some of their work. And again, these links that you see on your screen now in the image area are live, and again, we'll be sending them to you in a follow-up email. So the image here on the left shows Shobita, and underneath it are links to her University of Michigan faculty page. And the second link and bullet point is to her first book, Building Genetic Medicine, Breast Cancer Technology and the Comparative Politics of Healthcare. And on the right, we see Tania Simoncelli's photo, and under it, 2 bullet points. The first one is to Tania's TED Talk, which is titled, Should You Be Able to Patent a Human Gene? And the second bullet is to a book that she co-authored with Sheldon Krinsky, and its title is Genetic Justice, DNA Databanks, Criminal Investigations, and Civil Liberties. And that was a Columbia University Press book that came out in 2010. Okay, the next slide is titled Follow the Conversation and includes live links to the CGS Twitter feed, which is hashtag Talking Biopolitics. Actually, that's the hashtag for this conversation about this session. And you can live tweet any comments or questions there. And also shows on the slide the CGS Twitter account at C_G_S, and you can follow us there. We invite you to do that. And the slide also shows a link to the CGS website, www.geneticsandSociety.org, where you'll find many, many resources on a range of human genetic and assisted reproductive technology issues. So that's our brief break, and it's about 1/4 till the hour now. So we'll be able to go for another 15 minutes, and we'll finish up on the hour. And I will now turn it back over to Shobita and Tania and your questions and comments.
All right, we're back. Okay, we are back. Excellent. Okay, so we've got a couple of really great questions, so maybe we should start with some questions we're getting from viewers. First question, to what extent do you think the different approaches to grappling with these technologies reflect different historical understandings of the history of science and its relationship to eugenics? It's a great question.
Yeah, I think, and of course, it's there are a couple of ways to answer that. I think one way to answer it, at least, is to think about, obviously there's, a eugenic history in both the U.S. and in Europe, but the extent to which it's central as part of the way that different societies think about science policy and policy for emerging technologies is very different. Our legacy of eugenics in the U.S. has tended not to implicate or not to influence the way we think about genomics or genomic technologies. In fact, to the extent that we think about it as though it happened in Europe, right? Mm-hmm. By contrast, there's no question that German genetics, bioethics, discussions around intellectual property, as well as surrounding countries, there is a little bit more explicit language around that, as well as a lot of implicit language. So one of the comparative cases I talk about in the book is around human embryonic stem cells. Mm-hmm. And in the European context, there are a variety of different civil society groups who get involved, and it is very much focused on questions of commodification and also questions around germline gene editing and sort of, affecting future generations. And in the U.S., that has entirely disappeared from the conversation, right? So the conversation about human embryonic stem cells in the U.S. is about whether or not patents are going to stifle innovation or not. Right, and so I think that it's sort of the way we've reconstructed our memories of these kinds of events. I think that have had a major impact. Yeah, that's great, and it's a really great question. Second question. Oh, we've got another question. Three questions now. Do you agree that norms and best practices, based at least in part on the kinds of social justice concerns you were discussing, can play a role in shaping the choices that inventors and patent holders make? It seems that academic patent holders have made some progress in developing patenting and licensing practices that are responsive to these concerns. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that gets in, yes, I think absolutely. And in particular, I think this implicitly, if not explicitly, raises the recent discussions around ethical licensing. Mm-hmm. So most well known is the fact that the Broad Institute has a number of clauses in its license agreement that essentially prohibit any licensee from, for example, engaging in human germline gene editing, creating gene drives, creating terminator seeds, etc. So there are a number of things like that. There are also
These are the CRISPR.
These are the CRISPR, yeah, the CRISPR-Cas9. Right. Yeah. And you can see it elsewhere. The universities allied for essential medicines have advocated and on occasion been successful in getting universities, for example, to put language in the licenses that they write when they're talking about licensing early stage patents related to essential medicines to ensure that there is non-exclusive licensing for patents related to essential medicines for their use in the developing world. So there are definitely now, I think, a number of models where we could say, patent holders and inventors, broadly speaking, can actually incorporate their own social justice concerns or their own public interest concerns into the way they choose to license their patents, and of course also whether or not they choose to patent at all. But I want to raise a couple of, I think, limitations to that, right? So the first is, and this is again going back to this point about, market making and market shaping, is that, when I think about these as being the ways in which we address this question, I think about the fact that this, to me, is a very American solution because it puts that moral responsibility in the hands of the market players, right?
Or the science and technology promoters and the people who have an interest in the patent.
They have an interest in the patents, but they also have an interest in, we're sort of trusting their moral standards, right? Their moral codes. And in some cases, so we also don't know what, these are not necessarily systematic or transparent processes by which these patent holders are making decisions about how they decide what's going to be a limitation to their license, right, or the way they structure their patents, right? In theory, anyway, that's the role that government should play, right? And we do have a habit here of devolving that authority to market players. Given that overall approach, I think, that's a good interim solution. But it also, I think, shouldn't absolve us of the bigger questions around the government's responsibility, as well as a role for public interest and social justice groups in kind of pushing those innovators.
That's where I was just about to go, right? Yeah. So I was going to say, could you design sort of processes to make that an even more kind of robust sort of approach? So you could imagine those patentees, actually, creating opportunities to get broader input.
Yes.
Or you can imagine civil society organizations, making a big push to try to influence, and you could say maybe they are being influenced by, things that are being talked about in the news and issues that these groups are bringing up. But it'd be interesting to try to document how much influence we're having in those spaces. I mean, and this brings us back to sort of other things you talk in, your book is, you talk about sort of these various case studies where, civil society organizations or individuals or activists have tried to kind of disrupt the system, right? So one of my favorite examples is the Jeremy Rifkin, Stuart Newman, patent application, where they basically, they file a patent application on a human-animal chimera. So talk a little bit about that. What did they try to do in that instance, and were they successful? How did it play out?
Sure. So I'm going to step back just a little bit from that question and talk more broadly about animal patents in the U.S.
Yeah,
to me, I always joke that to me the story of animal patents in the United States is a Goldilocks story, essentially, right? So first I should say that this is, a debate that's happening in the late 1980s into the 1990s, and, first, you have farmers, religious groups, animal rights activists, environmentalists, Jeremy Rifkin, others who are concerned about emerging technologies and the ethics of emerging technologies. So first they go to Congress, and they're successful in getting, a series of congressional hearings. But this is where, and this is, one of the concepts that I developed in the book is this idea of expertise barriers, right? And they're certainly not just structural material barriers, they're often around knowledge. And so the first place that they experience these expertise barriers is in Congress, where they're told they don't know, they don't understand, they're ignorant, et cetera, right? So that, that seems, there are moments where it seems promising, but it sort of shuts down. The next, that bed didn't work for Goldilocks, right? So then they go, another animal rights group, the Animal Legal Defense Fund that's based actually in California, says, okay, the way that the PTO, the Patent and Trademark Office, has interpreted the patentability of animals, based on a microorganism, which was the Chakrabarti case, is messed up. So we're going to file a lawsuit saying that the Patent Office should have actually gotten public comment. And so they file suit. And the court says, who are you? You don't have legal standing. You don't have any cause or controversy. This is not directly affecting you. And so they get rebuffed there as well, right? So that's, dead number 2 for Goldilocks, right? And in that moment, what one of the arguments that I make in the book is that what ultimately the legal standing requirements in the U.S. mean is that the only people who can really participate in the system are people who have a commercial interest, right? So it really restricts public interest engagement of any other stripe.
Yeah.
And then
usually one patent holder fighting another patent holder about who got there first and really who deserves credit.
Right.
And then, you rarely see these other moments, which are, all the moments that you describe in the book, right? As the sort of the kernels of sort of something different happening, right? Where people are challenging whether something should have been patented in the first place or what should or should not be eligible for a patent, right? And
So then we get to the Newman-Rifkin patent. So, they've now been rebuffed in the legislative branch and the judicial branch, and so they go to the executive branch, and they go directly to the PTO, and they say, okay, they've not been clear about what they mean by animal. They also, the PTO has produced a language that says essentially, we'll allow animal patents, but we won't allow patents on human beings. So Newman and Rifkin say, we're gonna test this idea, right? And they say, what's a human being anyway in an age of biotechnology? A question, that they raised in the 1990s, and of course is equally, if not more, problematic today, right? When we again talk about CRISPR-Cas9 kinds of questions. So they file a patent application on a human-animal chimera. And the patent office says it's a human being, and they say, well, how much of a human being does it have to be a human being? They're trying to they keep going back and forth, and ultimately, the patent office keeps rejecting it. Ultimately, they give up, but after about 10 years of kind of the same language over and over again. But again, this is not just a moment where the patent office, the patent system is failing at dealing with a very serious question that, as I said, we're still managing today. But it's a moment where the patent office commissioner says, I don't have any problem with a patent on a human being. I have a problem with this interference in this expert space. And in some way, that tells you all you need to know, right, about how we understand the patent system, what the problems are about interpreting the patent system that way in a democracy. For me, I love looking at highly technical spaces and understanding the broad dimensions of it. But for me, this is actually, it highlights a much broader problem, I think, in innovation policy and technical policy domains, which is we need to think much more critically about how we balance what social justice, public interest, democratic questions mean when you're talking about technical policy questions like this.
Yep. Yeah, that's wonderful. I think we might have time for just one more question. We have maybe 2 more minutes.
Okay,
I'll be brief. But the last question is, what do you think accounts for the disparity in eligibility of patents? I.e., what qualifies for a patent and what does not?
So
we've sort of talked about throughout this discussion, but I think they're getting at sort of what is patent eligible under the law.
Right.
Right.
So, I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting is that, and I'm assuming the difference or the disparity, we're talking about the U.S. and Europe, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, for the most part, patent eligibility in the U.S. and Europe is basically identical, right? Novelty, inventive step, it has to not be obvious, it has to be useful. In Europe, they have this clause called the Ordre Public clause, which in the age of biotech has now been kind of understood as a bioethics clause. But sort of in some ways, the central motivating factor behind the book is to show that, you know, first of all, you know, actually, the U.S. has something called a moral utility doctrine. It's just that we don't use it.
Yeah.
So the point, I think, for me is that beyond the law, there is a political culture, there's ideology, there are historical dimensions that mean that these two places interpret patent eligibility that on its face looks the same in totally different ways with serious consequences for democratic engagement.
Yeah, that's a perfect summary of the overarching theme of your book, and also a perfect place, I think. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I think it's actually a perfect place for us to wrap up. Thanks, everybody, for listening.
Thank you.